The ballroom fell silent the moment the billionaire pointed toward the old waitress. "Get her out of here." His voice echoed across the grand hall of the Royal Crest Hotel, where crystal chandeliers reflected off polished marble floors, and hundreds of wealthy guests watched in stunned curiosity. The orchestra stopped playing. Conversations faded into whispers. Every eye turned toward the elderly woman standing quietly beside a serving cart. She couldn't have been more than 75 years old. Her silver hair was neatly tied beneath a simple hairnet, and the wrinkles on her face spoke of decades spent working hard without complaint. Her uniform was spotless, but unlike everyone else in the room dressed in designer suits and custom-made gowns, she looked invisible. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply lowered her eyes, removed her white apron with trembling hands, folded it carefully over her arm, and picked up the small leather handbag she had brought to work that morning. Security officers immediately began walking toward her. Some guests smiled, assuming she must have made an unforgivable mistake. Others lifted their phones, sensing that drama was about to unfold at the most expensive wedding reception of the year. The billionaire groom, Ethan Sinclair, straightened his tuxedo and spoke again. "I don't care who hired her. She embarrassed this family. Escort her out before she ruins another second of this celebration." The old waitress nodded softly as if she had expected those words all along. She took one slow step toward the exit, then another. Her worn black shoes echoed against the marble floor, just as one of the guards reached for her arm. A trembling voice cut through the silence. "Nobody touches her." Every head turned. At the center table, 80-year-old Margaret Sinclair, the billionaire's mother, slowly pushed back her chair and struggled to her feet. Her hands shook. Tears instantly filled her eyes. She stared across the ballroom at the elderly waitress as though she had just seen someone return from the dead. The waitress froze. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Then Margaret whispered 4 words that sent a chill through every person in the room. "She saved my life." The ballroom exploded into confused murmurs. Ethan frowned. "What are you talking about, Mother?" Margaret ignored him completely. Instead, she slowly walked across the ballroom despite her age, her eyes never leaving the elderly waitress. The guests instinctively stepped aside, creating a path between the two women. The old waitress's lips trembled. "Margaret," she whispered. Margaret reached her. Without saying another word, she wrapped her arms around the woman her own son had just ordered security to throw out. The embrace lasted several seconds, long enough for the entire ballroom to realize something unbelievable was happening. If you enjoy stories filled with powerful secrets, emotional reunions, and unforgettable endings, take a second to subscribe to Hidden Motives. You never know which hidden truth will change everything in the next story. When Margaret finally stepped back, tears streamed freely down her face. "I've spent 43 years looking for you." The old waitress smiled sadly. "I promised I'd never come looking for you." Ethan stood frozen. He had built a business empire worth billions. He knew presidents, celebrities, and royalty. Yet he had never seen his mother cry like this. Not even when his father died. Not even during his own wedding ceremony. "Mother," Ethan said carefully, "who is this woman?" Margaret slowly turned toward him. Her expression changed from relief to disappointment. "You don't recognize the woman whose sacrifice made this family possible?" The question hit Ethan harder than any insult ever had. He looked back at the waitress. Nothing about her seemed familiar. She looked like an ordinary hotel employee nearing retirement. Certainly not someone connected to the Sinclair family. "I'm sorry," he admitted. "I don't." Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. Then she looked around the ballroom filled with wealthy executives, politicians, celebrities, and investors. "You all see an old waitress." She paused. "I see the woman who gave up everything, so I could have the life standing in front of you today." The room became so quiet that the soft hum of the chandeliers seemed loud. Even the photographers lowered their cameras. Nobody wanted to miss what came next. The old waitress looked down at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. She gently wiped away a tear before speaking. "Margaret, you don't have to tell them." Margaret reached for both of her hands. "After all these years, I refuse to stay silent any longer." She slowly turned toward the guests. 43 years ago, my husband and I weren't rich. We weren't even comfortable. We had just opened a tiny family restaurant, and we were drowning in debt. The bank was preparing to seize everything we owned. The guests exchanged surprised glances. Most of them had only known the Sinclair family as billionaires. No one had imagined they had once struggled to survive. Margaret continued. One rainy evening, I collapsed in that restaurant. I had ignored chest pains for weeks because we couldn't afford a doctor. She looked back at the waitress. Everyone panicked, except her. The old waitress lowered her eyes. Margaret smiled through her tears. Her name is Eleanor. For the first time, the ballroom knew the woman who had been dismissed as just another employee. Eleanor wasn't even working for us, Margaret said. She was a customer finishing her dinner. But she immediately recognized what was happening. She had once trained as a nurse before life forced her to abandon her education. Gasps spread across the room. Eleanor kept me alive until the ambulance arrived. She paused. But that's only the beginning. Ethan stood motionless. Everything he believed about his family's history suddenly felt incomplete. Margaret continued. When I woke up in the hospital, the doctors said I needed emergency surgery. Without it, I wouldn't survive. She took a deep breath. The operation cost more money than your father and I had ever seen. The silence became heavier. We couldn't pay. Margaret looked at Eleanor again. So she disappeared. The guests frowned in confusion. 3 days later, the hospital administrator came into my room, smiling. He said someone had paid every single medical bill. The ballroom erupted into whispers. Ethan stared at Eleanor. You paid for my mother's surgery? Eleanor quickly shook her head. It wasn't important. It was everything. Margaret replied. You sold your house. The room froze. You sold the only home your family owned. A woman near the front covered her mouth. A businessman quietly lowered his head. Even the security guards looked stunned. Margaret's voice broke. Your father begged the administrator to tell us who had done it. He refused. It took me almost 20 years to discover it was Eleanor. Ethan's face turned pale. He looked at the elderly waitress standing only a few feet away. You became homeless? Eleanor smiled softly. I found another place. Margaret shook her head. No, you lived in your old car. More gasps echoed through the ballroom. And even after all that, Margaret continued. She refused to let us repay her. Eleanor finally spoke. You had 2 little children. You needed that money far more than I did. Ethan could barely breathe. His younger sister slowly walked beside him. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us? Margaret looked toward the grand ceiling before answering. Because I spent decades searching for Eleanor. I hired investigators. I searched hospitals. I searched nursing homes. I searched every city where someone thought they had seen her. She smiled sadly. Every trail ended cold. Then she looked around the ballroom. And today, of all days, I walked into my son's wedding and saw her serving drinks. The room fell silent again. Ethan slowly approached Eleanor. Only minutes earlier, he had ordered security to remove her without asking a single question. Now each step felt heavier than the last. When he finally stood before her, he couldn't even meet her eyes. His voice cracked. I'm so sorry. Eleanor gently smiled. You couldn't have known. No. Ethan shook his head. I should have known enough to treat you with respect anyway. His words lingered in the air. The guests who had laughed when security approached Eleanor suddenly looked ashamed. Several quietly lowered their heads. One of the investors who had mocked her appearance earlier slipped away from his table, unable to face the moment. But Eleanor wasn't focused on them. She looked at Ethan with kindness instead of anger. I forgave you the moment you spoke, she said softly. Sometimes success makes people forget that every stranger has a story. Her words settled over the ballroom like a quiet lesson no one would ever forget. Just when it seemed the truth had finally been revealed, an elderly lawyer standing near the stage slowly raised his hand. There is one more thing everyone here deserves to know. The ballroom turned toward him. Eleanor's expression changed instantly. For the first time that evening, she looked afraid. The elderly lawyer slowly walked toward the center of the ballroom, his polished shoes echoing across the silent marble floor. His gray hair and calm expression commanded immediate respect, and when he stopped beside Eleanor, he gently removed his glasses before speaking. My name is Richard Collins, he said. I've been the Sinclair family's attorney for more than 30 years. He looked at Margaret. I hoped this day would never require me to reveal this secret. Margaret's face tightened. You know? Richard nodded. I promised Eleanor I would protect it unless the truth became absolutely necessary. Ethan frowned. What truth? Richard reached into the leather briefcase he had been carrying and carefully removed a worn manila envelope. Its edges had yellowed with age, and the seal had never been broken. I have carried these documents for 27 years. The ballroom became so quiet that every rustle of the envelope could be heard. Richard looked directly at Eleanor. "I'm sorry." She slowly closed her eyes. "I suppose it's finally time." He turned back to Ethan. "Your mother told you that Eleanor sold her home to pay for the surgery. That is true, but she left out the greatest sacrifice." Ethan felt his heart pounding. Richard carefully unfolded an old hospital document. The surgery wasn't the only expense. The Sinclair restaurant had already been declared bankrupt. The bank was preparing to auction everything your parents owned. Several businessmen exchanged shocked looks. Richard continued, "If that auction had happened, the Sinclair family would have lost everything. The restaurant, the equipment, the building, the business, the family name." He paused. There would never have been a Sinclair empire. The words struck the room like thunder. Richard lifted another document. On the morning before the auction, Eleanor withdrew every dollar she had, not just from selling her house, but from every savings account she owned, every retirement fund, every investment, everything. He looked toward Ethan. She paid the debts herself. The room erupted into stunned whispers. Ethan shook his head. "No." Richard nodded slowly. "Your family's business survived because Eleanor sacrificed her entire future." Ethan's knees felt weak. He looked toward the elegant ballroom. The luxury, the flowers, the orchestra, the designer suits, everything surrounding him, had begun because of one woman who now stood in a simple waitress uniform. He whispered, "Everything I built," Richard gently interrupted, "was built upon a foundation she refused to take credit for." Margaret wiped away fresh tears. "I wanted to repay her. I searched everywhere, but Eleanor disappeared." Richard smiled sadly. "Because she made me promise." He unfolded a handwritten letter. "She left this with me. If Margaret or her family ever found success, she said they were never to know where she had gone." Ethan stared at Eleanor. "Why?" Her answer came almost immediately. "Because gratitude should never become a burden." The ballroom remained silent. "I didn't help your family because I expected anything back. I helped because someone needed help." She smiled softly. "And one day, I hoped someone would do the same for another stranger." Several guests quietly wiped away tears. Richard looked down at the final page inside the envelope. "There is one last document." Eleanor looked away. "No." Richard nodded gently. "I'm afraid they deserve to know." He handed the document to Ethan. Ethan looked at it. His eyes widened. It wasn't a receipt. It wasn't a contract. It was a property deed, signed by Eleanor, transferred to the Sinclair family for $1. Ethan looked up in disbelief. "You gave my father your house for $1? Eleanor smiled. "I couldn't let your family lose everything." At that moment, Ethan could no longer hold back his emotions. He walked toward Eleanor. Then, in front of hundreds of the most powerful people in the city, the billionaire dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his face. "I'm ashamed. I judged you by your uniform. I ordered security to throw out the woman who gave my family everything." His voice broke. "I can never repay what you've done." Eleanor gently placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "You already can." Ethan looked up. "How?" She smiled. "The next time someone who looks unimportant crosses your path, see them, listen to them, treat them with the dignity every human being deserves." She looked around the ballroom. "That will be worth more than anything money could ever buy." At that moment, every person in the room realized the greatest person at the billionaire's wedding wasn't wearing diamonds, wasn't sitting at the head table, and wasn't listed among the VIP guests. She had been quietly serving food, waiting tables, and expecting nothing in return. Ethan remained on his knees for several long seconds. The ballroom was so silent that the only sound anyone could hear was the quiet sobbing of guests trying to hold back their tears. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, the wedding guests began standing. Not because anyone asked them to, not because it was expected, but because they felt they were in the presence of someone whose character deserved more honor than wealth ever could. The applause started softly. Within moments, it spread across the entire ballroom. Business executives who had spent their lives chasing fortunes stood beside hotel employees earning hourly wages. Celebrities applauded beside kitchen staff. For the first time that evening, no one cared who was rich, No one cared who was famous. Everyone was simply honoring an extraordinary woman. Eleanor looked overwhelmed. "I've never liked being the center of attention," she said quietly. Margaret smiled through her tears. "I know. That's why this moment belongs to you." The applause continued. Even the musicians had stopped playing, choosing instead to clap with everyone else. Ethan slowly stood and turned toward the audience. "I owe everyone here an apology." The room became quiet again. "I've spent years building businesses. I've negotiated billion-dollar contracts. I believe success meant being respected." He looked toward Eleanor. "But tonight I've learned something I should have understood long ago." He paused. "Respect isn't something money buys. It's something character earns." He glanced toward the security guards. "When I ordered Eleanor removed, I didn't ask her name. I didn't ask what happened. I judged her because of a uniform." His voice became heavier. "And that's a mistake I'll spend the rest of my life making sure I never repeat." The audience nodded quietly. Many recognized themselves in his confession. How many times had they walked past cleaners, waiters, drivers, janitors, without ever wondering about the lives they lived outside their uniforms? Margaret gently held Eleanor's hand. "There is something else." Eleanor smiled nervously. "Margaret, no. This time, you'll let me finish." She turned toward the guests. "Many of you know the Sinclair Foundation." Several people nodded. "It was one of the largest charitable organizations in the country. For years you've praised our generosity." She smiled sadly. "But the truth is, our family's greatest act of generosity was never ours." She looked at Eleanor. It began with hers. The ballroom erupted into another round of applause. Ethan suddenly removed the gold family pin from the lapel of his tuxedo. It was a symbol worn only by members of the Sinclair family. Without saying a word, he walked over and carefully pinned it onto Eleanor's uniform. Gasps echoed across the room. "From this day forward," Ethan announced, "everyone who carries the Sinclair name will know yours." He looked directly at her. "You didn't just save my mother's life. You saved my family's future. And today, I would be honored if you accepted something you've deserved for decades." Eleanor looked confused. "What do you mean?" Ethan smiled. "I'd like you to become chairwoman of the Sinclair Foundation." The ballroom exploded into applause. Eleanor immediately shook her head. "Oh no, I'm far too old." Ethan laughed softly. "I'm not asking you to run offices. I'm asking you to help us remember why the foundation exists." Margaret nodded. "To remind us that kindness without recognition is the purest kindness of all." Eleanor stood quietly for a long moment. Finally, she smiled. "I'll accept, but only on one condition." Ethan laughed. "I had a feeling there would be one." She looked around the ballroom. "No scholarship, no hospital, no building, no project will ever carry my name." The room looked puzzled. Eleanor continued. "If someone receives help, I don't want them thanking me. I want them to help someone else." She smiled warmly. "That's how kindness grows." Richard Collins quietly laughed. "I've known Eleanor for almost 30 years. I should have guessed she'd say exactly that." The orchestra slowly began playing again. This time, not the music prepared for the reception. Instead, a soft piano melody filled the ballroom. Ethan looked at his bride. "I'm sorry our wedding turned into something completely unexpected." His bride smiled and gently took his hand. "No," she whispered. "It became something unforgettable." The guests would eventually forget the price of the flowers. They would forget the luxury cars parked outside. They would forget the designer suits and expensive jewelry. But every person who attended that wedding would remember the elderly waitress who quietly changed the meaning of success. Years later, whenever anyone asked Ethan Sinclair about the greatest investment he had ever witnessed, he never mentioned stocks. He never mentioned real estate. He never mentioned billion-dollar companies. He simply smiled and said, "It was made by a waitress who gave away everything she owned and asked for nothing in return." If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Motives for more cinematic fictional stories filled with powerful twists, emotional journeys, and unforgettable life lessons. And now we'd love to hear from you. If you had been sitting in that ballroom, would you have judged Eleanor by her uniform, or would you have taken the time to learn her story before making assumptions? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your answer might inspire someone else to look beyond appearances.